My name is DeCorte. I'm a senior technical architect at Solíant Consulting, and it's very happy to see so many of you here. Very happy that this is the biggest DevCon ever. Very exciting after all these years. All right, so who am I? It appears I am the human incarnation of caffeine. I don't know how that happened. But it has a very good side benefit. I smell really good in the morning. I started going to DevCon in the last century. That's how old I am. And I've spoken at about roughly half of these developer conferences. And I work at Solíant Consulting. We have a great team, as you may have seen from the number of speakers that we have here at the conference this year. So yeah, very honored to be working with them and all the good stuff that they do. All right, so alphabet soup, external authentication, alphabet soup. We'll cover all of these things, EA, AD, OD, and what they mean, what they stand for, and especially what is new on the OAuth side. So let's jump right in, right? So the first of those acronyms was EA, stands for External Authentication. So we'll cover what has changed, right? So what is FileMaker 16 bringing to us in this realm? Oops. Oh, well. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? When we say authentication, we mean, how do you prove that you are who you are, right? That is, can you prove your identity before you get into the solution? And in FileMaker terms, we're talking about that first tab when you open Managed Security, right? It's all about the accounts, right? The accounts is where you set up credentials, a username and a password, and that's how you prove that you are who you are, right? So that's your identity. What we are not going to talk about is authorization, right? Once you are in the solution, you have a set of rights, a set of privileges, and that's defined in the privilege set. That's the second tab over in Managed Security, right? We're not going to talk about that, right? So we're not going to talk about, can I go to this layout, can I view the data in that record? We are going to talk strictly about the authentication, right? The who are you? That's the piece that we are going to cover. So authentication, if it's external, what it really means is that it is not FileMaker that does the authentication, right? It's something else. And we will talk about what these other things are. When FileMaker 7 was released back in 2004, we were giving 3 external authentication providers: the Windows Active Directory, the Apple Open Directory, and the little brother, or very often overlooked, is the fact that you can use local accounts and local groups on the FileMaker server machine itself, right? So if the machine is not tied to an Active Directory domain or an Open Directory domain, you can still use external authentication using the accounts and groups in the operating system of the machine that has FileMaker server, right? So we've had these since FileMaker 7. So how do you start using them? In the session materials that I had uploaded a while ago, there's a white paper called Server External Authentication that I co-wrote with my good friend Stephen Blackwell, who's in the audience as well. We wrote that back in 2004. It has been updated a few times over the years. It's still very relevant. All of the screenshots are dated, absolutely, right? So when we show Active Directory, it doesn't look that way anymore. But all of the concepts, all of the how do I set it up and why do I set it up and what are the gotchas when I get there, those are still very relevant in that document, right? So I'm not going to cover setting all of that up. I'm not going to show you how to set up an Active Directory, any of that. That's all described in a lot of detail in that white paper. In essence, it comes down to this, and this has been the same since FileMaker Server 7 all the way up to this version. I'm showing FileMaker Server 14 here. If you go to Database Server, you go to the Security tab, there's a toggle, there's a drop-down there. If you switch that drop-down so that it says FileMaker and external server accounts, that's pretty much all you have to do in FileMaker Server, in the admin console, to enable external authentication using those 3 traditional providers: Active Directory, AD, Open Directory, OD, and local accounts and groups, right? So that's all it takes on the FileMaker Server side. Over in your FileMaker solution, you'll have to create accounts that are matched to something that exists in that identity provider, AD, OD, that kind of thing, right? So When you set up an account in FileMaker, you switch it over to external server. And as you can see, when you do that, entry field right below it switches to group name, right? So you have to provide a group name that exists in Active Directory, Open Directory, or on the operating system of the FileMaker server machine. And then you attach it to, you give it a privilege set that will dictate what the user can do once they are in, right? So that's what you do on the FileMaker Pro side. On the FileMaker server side, all you do is toggle this switch. Now, there's a little more configuration that needs to happen on the operating system side of things, right? So in order to use external authentication with Active Directory or Open Directory, the machine itself, the operating system of the machine, has to be tied to that Active Directory or the Open Directory. All of that is described in that white paper, right? So why would you use it? There's many reasons, and all of them, again, are described in that white paper, but the big ones are account management, right? It means that you don't have to do individual account management in your FileMaker solutions. If you have a group, and you set up the group inside your FileMaker solution, that means you can keep adding and removing people to those groups completely outside of FileMaker, right? So you don't have to go into your FileMaker solution to give somebody access or remove somebody's access. And obviously, that is of tremendous benefit if you have an existing identity management infrastructure, right? If the organization already uses Active Directory or Open Directory, then you can just leverage that and use it for your FileMaker solutions. The other big benefit that you have is that you get instant access to a lot of authentication features that you don't have natively in FileMaker, right? So you can take advantage of password complexity rules, password expiry rules, geographical location, right? They can limit who can log in from what location. You can limit who gets to access during certain days of the week, certain times of the day. So all of that is already built into those identity management solutions, and that you can now just leverage in your FileMaker solution. Things like multi-factor authentication, right? So all of these, Active Directory, Open Directory, and the other OAuth ones that we'll talk about in a minute, they offer that natively. And it means that it's now available to you to use for your FileMaker solutions. There is one setting on FileMaker Server Directory Service that talks about directory servers, right? An Active Directory and Open Directory are called directory services, right? Because they keep a directory of users and groups. That is not the feature that you need to enable external authentication in FileMaker. That feature basically goes hand in hand with a feature on the FileMaker Pro side, right there, where you can configure how users find your FileMaker server, right? So that feature, all it does, it shows people where your FileMaker server is. It does nothing for authentication, right? So if you ever go there and try to enable this or fiddle with this and in the hopes of enabling authentication, I will haunt you in your sleep. All right, so these are the three traditional ones that we've had since FileMaker 7. So we've had them for a really long time. In FileMaker 16, we now have 3 new OAuth providers. So we have 3 additional identity management providers that we can use to prove who you are and give access to your FileMaker solutions, right? So Microsoft Azure, Amazon, and Google accounts can be used in your FileMaker solutions. OAuth is a standard, and it has a very intricate dance between the user that wants to authenticate and then the authentication provider. You don't need to know all of this, and we will not go into a lot of detail here. It's probably not a bad idea if you get somewhat familiar with how it works and why it's there in the first place, but we won't go into a lot of detail in this session. The end result is something like this, right? If you configure your FileMaker server, which we will do in this session, if you can configure your FileMaker server to take advantage of these providers, your login dialog will look something like this, right? So you wouldn't necessarily have all 3 of them. I have enabled all 3 of them in this one. It could be one, could be multiple. But the users can basically have, they can type in their FileMaker account and password in the top section, or they can click a button, one of these 3 buttons, which will then take them to a web page of that provider where they can type in their credentials, and that will basically complete the round trip all the way back into FileMaker, and they will get into the solution. All right? So inside your solution, this is what one of those web pages would look like, where the user types in their credentials. In your solution, you can then pick up using those get functions that we've had to see, okay, who is that user? There's a new get function in FileMaker 16, get account group name. That is very handy so that you can see what group they belong to. If the identity provider, Active Directory, Open Directory, the OAuth ones, not all of them support group-based authentication. We'll get into that in a sec. But if they do, you can see what group they belong to, right? So if you use Active Directory and somebody belongs to a group, they log into your solution, the name of that group will be visible through that new get function, get account group name. The next and the biggest part of this session will be me stepping you through how you configure your FileMaker server, the OAuth provider, Azure, Google, Amazon, and how you configure your FileMaker solution to take advantage of that. So that's what we will cover in the remainder of the session. You don't need to remember all the steps or memorize all the steps that we will take, right? There's a 50-page document in the session materials that has very detailed, step-by-step, with lots of screenshots, basically a how-to on how to configure it, right? So you don't need to scribble a lot of notes on how I do it. Everything is outlined in that. I will also show a lot of videos on how to do it. I will make the videos available to you after the session as well. All right, so from here on, it's all demo. And to set the stage a little bit, we basically have our FileMaker Server 16, right? It hosts that file, the DevCon 2017 file. That is the one that we will configure to use. If we go ahead and open that in FileMaker 16, you'll see that at this point, the login dialog is still the same as we always had, right? So we don't see those extra buttons, and the accounts that exist in that file are just the standard FileMaker accounts, right? So there's nothing fancy going on in that file as we have it at this point, right? So that is what we will be using for the session, and that's the file that we will configure, right? So there's 3 of them, right? So 3 new providers, Microsoft Azure, Google, and Amazon. We will start with Microsoft Azure for a particular reason, because it's the most intricate one to set up. I won't say difficult, because one of the things I want you to take away from this session is that setting this up is surprisingly easy, right? If you're not familiar with a lot of these concepts and terminologies, it can be a little daunting, but it is very easy to set it up, and it is very powerful once you have it set up. The Microsoft Azure one is the most complex one. That's why we will start with that, because it'll cover all the concepts that we need to cover. Then once we get to Google and Amazon, it'll be that simple. The demo basically will cover will be broken down in the same parts for all 3 of them, right? The first part will be, what do we need to do on the FileMaker server side, and what do we need to do on the Microsoft Azure side, on the provider side, right? And then we will turn around and see what we need to do in your FileMaker solution to basically tie it all together, right? So we'll start with Microsoft's offering, and we will go over what we need to do on FileMaker server first, right? So that's our FileMaker server. We have the file. We will go to the security tab. And one of the things that we need to make sure that we have as sort of like a prerequisite is, since the provider, the identity provider, is not on your network, right? It sits out there. It sits on the internet. So when the user tries to log in, they will be taken to a web page that belongs to that identity provider, right? So Google's page, Amazon's page, Microsoft Azure's page. When they say, yep, I know this user, that the set of credentials that you provided is good, I recognize this user, they will need to talk back to FileMaker server, right? And there's a configuration setting that we will cover that does that, right? That says, yep, talk back to me at this address. That means that your FileMaker server needs to be reachable, right, from the internet. That means that, and it has to be secure. It also only works over HTTPS. That means that you need to enable FileMaker server to use a custom SSL certificate. This does not work with the standard default SSL certificate. So you have to have a custom one. So that's the first of the prerequisites. The other one is that the path all the way down to your FileMaker server has to be reachable, right? So you have to have the necessary ports available. Well, it's not a fancy port, it's port 443, the default HTTPS port, but it has to be routable from that identity provider down to your FileMaker server, right? So your firewall, your router, a DNS name, so all of that has to be in place so that when you tell the Microsoft Azure, here's my server, that Azure can actually find your server. All right, so that's why I'm showing you that we have a custom SSL certificate on that server. Then we basically toggle this one on, right? So that's our toggle to enable external authentication. And at this point, even if we don't enable one of these other three, we have already enabled it so that it works with Active Directory and Open Directory and the other ones. All right. Where we are now is we are basically in Microsoft Azure in the portal. Let's see if I can pause this a sec. Right, so we are portal azure.com. So this sort of assumes that you have an account with Microsoft Azure already, right? So that's as the developer account. So once you have it, you go to this thing here. That's the symbol for the Azure Active Directory. The first thing that we will need there is we have to set up an application, right? The application really doesn't do much of anything, but it's a place to store configuration settings on the Azure side, right? So we'll just create an application. We'll call it DevCon 2017. There's only two options there. We'll leave it at Web API. Now this one, you can tell by the red asterisk, it's a mandatory field. So we'll have to provide a URL there. What we type there isn't really that important. Not for the purpose of setting up the demo and making authentication work, right? For legal reasons and other reasons, you may want to provide a URL where users can read up on privacy rules and consent things that you have. But for the purpose of authentication, this one is not relevant. That's why I call it notimportant.com, right? So this is not the URL that Microsoft Azure will use to talk back to your FileMaker server. That'll come later. All right, so we'll just go ahead and create that. And there we have our application on the Azure side. There's a couple of things that we will need. And the first one is we will put in the address, right? The address that I talked about that Microsoft Azure will use to talk back to your FileMaker server. You can find a format there when you go to your FileMaker server, right? So I just copied it over. I'll put it in there, and I'll substitute those placeholders with the fully qualified DNS name of my FileMaker server. And if I were to use a non-default port, I would include a port as well. But this is just the DNS name of my server, accessible from the outside. No. Question is, will it work with IP addresses? The answer is no, right? Because you cannot have an SSL certificate issued to an IP address. So it has to be a fully qualified domain name. The second part that we will do is every application has an application ID, right? So we will copy that over. We'll go back to our FileMaker server, and we'll put it there where it says Azure Client ID, right? So that's the application ID of your application on the Azure side. The next thing is we will generate a key. That's another element that we'll need there to configure FileMaker server. You may have noticed when you pick a key, there's an option there to have its validity for 1 year, 2 years, never expires. I just chose never expires for demo purposes. Obviously, you want to give some thought to that, right? So this is one of those convenience versus security. If the key expires, you'll have to come in and renew this, set it up here, and then take the new key and put it in your FileMaker server configuration, which is the most secure thing to do, right? If you set it to never expire and your key gets compromised, that would obviously not be a good thing for your overall security, right? So I'll copy the key, go back to my FileMaker server, and put it in there. right? Now we need one more thing. We need the Azure tenant ID as the last bit of information that I need to configure my FileMaker server, right? And that one is not tied to your application. This one is actually tied to your Azure AD itself, right? So if I go there and I go to Properties, the Directory ID, that's the one we need to put in there and use the Azure tenant ID. And that completes our configuration on the FileMaker server side, right? So you don't need to worry or fret about remembering what I did. Everything's documented in that white paper. They had a question?
Yes, it looks a little confusing because you're referring to it in an application. I wonder if you can clarify that. And also, I see the IDs, sometimes you call them an application ID, but it says client ID. I've never seen that before, so
Yep.
I know what they're talking about.
So the question is, and I was trying to gloss over that conveniently, Azure is the only one like that. So the question was, things are called one way on the Azure side. They're called a different way on the FileMaker server side. It's unfortunate. You will not see that on the Google side or the Amazon side. I don't know why, is the simple answer. Once you've seen this in action, you know where to put things, but there's really no rhyme or reason why they're called what they're called, so it is what it is.
The FileMaker docs, when it says take the application ID and put it in the client.
Yeah, I don't know whether, if it's like in a knowledge base article or anything like that, but it's certainly in my white paper, so you have all the screenshots of what it is. All right, so once we've done that, once we've put in those configuration settings in FileMaker server, you will have to restart your FileMaker server. So that may be something that you'll have to keep in mind as you go through this, purely from a timing point of view, I guess, so that you don't do this when users are actively working in your solution, right? So we'll go ahead and restart our FileMaker server. All right, we don't need to wait for that. So that was the first part, right? So I've showed you how to set it up on the Azure side with that application that you have on Azure and how you can take back those pieces of information and put them on the FileMaker server side. The next piece is going to be what do we do now over in our application side, right, in our FileMaker solution. So obviously we'll have to create accounts, right? So we'll have to set up accounts in FileMaker server. You'll see that we already have our Microsoft button right there. If I were to click it, nothing would happen, right? Because I don't have accounts in my solution yet at this point. But the login dialog has already picked up on the fact that my FileMaker server is configured now to enable the Microsoft Azure one, right? So we create an account and we pick Microsoft Azure. We have two options here, group and user, right? Of those three new providers, only Azure offers those two options. Amazon and Google only do it on an individual basis. So for now, I'll pick user. I'll put in an account, and we'll commit that. So when we reopen our solution, I'll close it and go back in. I will now click that Microsoft button and see what happens. All right? So we are now taken to the Microsoft Azure web page to log in. Since this is the very first time that I use this account to log into my solution, or actually to log into that application that we've created on the Azure side, we are asked for consent, right? So do you agree that this account will be used for this application? This will only happen the very first time that you use this account. Now, I've put in my account on the Azure side. At this point, Azure has said, yep, I know who you are. Your account is valid. You're good to go. What we're seeing now is browser behavior, right? This is Safari on Mac. And you may have seen this with other applications like GoToMeeting, some other stuff, where if it has to redirect to something like an application, it will say, are you sure that you want to do this? Not all browsers do that. Safari does that. So you have no control over this, is what I'm trying to say, right? So this is browser behavior. So I'll say, yep, I'm OK with that. And I'm in my solution, right? So obviously, I can prove that by going to the data viewer and looking at those get functions that I mentioned in the beginning. So I'll have to authenticate. But there we are, right? So my get account name is the account name of that Azure account that I've added to my FileMaker. There's no group name, right? Because I picked the individual user setting when I created the accounts on the FileMaker side. All right. So, as mentioned, Microsoft Azure is the only of the 3 new OAuth providers that gives us group authentication. So we'll have a look at what that looks like, what we have to do that, right? So in Azure AD, we can click on all groups. We'll create a group, have to give it a name. The name doesn't really matter, so we'll just call it Azure Group. Description is not mandatory, so I'll leave it be. And we have no members at this point, so I'll select one of the members that we have in our Azure AD. Now, this may throw you off a little because that account that I selected was a Gmail account, right? That doesn't really matter. Any email address can be set up to become a Microsoft, well, a Microsoft account. That's the long and short of it, right? So don't get thrown by the fact that it's a Gmail account, so by extension, it's a Google account. Any email address can be used to hook up or to be linked to a Microsoft account. All right, so we have our group. Group is named Azure Group, and we have one member in that group. Now, there's one more thing we need to do. By default, Microsoft Azure groups are not set up to allow group authentication, right? So in my application that I have set up on the Azure side, I have to click Manifest, and I'll have to change a setting there on line number 7, where it says Group Memberships Claims. I'll have to enable it, in essence, to allow for group authentication. It doesn't do it by default. So all of that, again, documented in that white paper that you have available. All right. So with that set up, now when I use an account that belongs to that group and I authenticate against Azure, it will say, yep, that's good, you belong to this group, we're good to go. All right, so we have the group, we have one member, so we can test that out. So on the FileMaker side, we'll also have to do something to make that same thing happen, right? So I know the screens go by fairly quickly, but when we set up the accounts, the WIM at Connecting Data accounts, we picked the individual user setting, right? So we'll set up a group account for the group that we've just created as the next step here. All right, so we'll click New, and when we pick Azure AD, the default is actually a group setting, so we'll leave it that. And this is what we put in the group name, right? So the name of our group was Azure Group, so that would be the logical thing to put in there, but that's not actually what we need, right? So you'll see that it says group name, but in parentheses it says object ID, right? So that is something that threw me in the beginning as I was trying to go with there. So we'll have to go back to our Azure AD, and we'll have to copy the object ID of our group, right? So that's what you need to use as the group name inside FileMaker. It's not the actual name of the group, it's the ID. All right, and just to make sure that we have something readable, I'll put it in the description, so that when I look at my list of accounts in FileMaker, I can sort of see what it meant there, right? So, all right, so we have one member that belongs to that group, right? We don't have that individual account set up inside the FileMaker accounts, right? So we just have that group name. So if we log in, so that's the one user, that's that Gmail account. If I log into my solution using that account, we should see that it works. All right, so we'll click the Microsoft button. That will take us to the Microsoft login page. And I have a fair number of accounts, but we'll use the Gmail account that we have for that one. And it will ask us for our passwords. And once we get past that, we should see that we end up in our FileMaker solution properly authenticated. Right? First time I use it, so again, it asks for consent. And after that, we are good to go. All right? So if we bring up the data viewer now, and we look at those get functions, we'll see it's pretty much the same as we had before. It'll tell us the exact name of the account that we used, which is the Gmail account. But this is the thing that we now have, right? So we now have the group name, object ID, as the new get function that will tell us what group we belong to, right? So that Gmail account does not exist as an account in FileMaker. It's only the group account that exists there, right? All right. One of the biggest differences, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the biggest differences between the Microsoft Azure implementation of OAuth for FileMaker and the one that we have with Google and Amazon is that if you enable Amazon or Google, any Amazon account, any Google account will work, right? We don't have the concept of having to add users to either something like Azure AD or a group, right? So any Google account will work, any Amazon account will work. With Azure, the user has to exist in your Azure AD, right? So you have to create the user there, meaning that there's a process to it, right? So if you want to give a new user access to your solution, you have to go through a process. You have to go through a process by adding that user to your Azure AD. The user, depending on whether that email address that you will use to add them to, the user may have to go through a separate process to link that email account to a Microsoft account, right? So this is the process of adding a user to the Azure AD. You may have noticed there were two options, right? Add a user, add a guest user. I'm using a guest user because I will be using another Gmail account. That Gmail account, by virtue of it being a Gmail account, doesn't belong to my domain, to my Azure domain, right? So you have two sets of users, I guess, you can add. You can add users that belong to your domain, or you can add users that do not belong to your domain, which is called invite a guest. All right, so I'll just put in a Gmail account. Now, what will happen basically is that as soon as I add this user, an email will go out to that user to say, you've been invited to this domain, right? So, and then the user will have to say, yep, I'm good with that, and all of that. So this user has now been added to our Active Directory domain on the Azure side. In the background, that user has received an email, right? So this is the email account for that particular user, and there's the invitation, right? So the reason for me to show this is not so much that you'll memorize it, but to be aware that if you're using Azure AD and you're inviting users to have access to your solution, there's a definite process for them to go to. And that's something that you may want to document and do for yourself so that you know exactly what your users will have to go through, so that you can document it and set some expectations, right? So in essence, what's happening here is that Gmail address, Microsoft didn't recognize it as a valid Microsoft account. So it'll go through all the steps to set it up as a Microsoft account. It'll set down the code, it'll do the email address verification. So all of that good stuff is happening in the background, right? So, and this would all be the user doing that, right? So that's not you. That's the user having to go through these steps to do that. Obviously, if they have existing Microsoft accounts, then none of this happens, and the process is a whole lot simpler, right? All right, so we are in the final stages of that user's account being linked and recognized as a Microsoft account. This page would typically update for them at some point. It would list that DevCon 2017 application that they've now agreed to use. But we don't need to wait for that, or the user can basically now try and log in straight to your FileMaker solution. What we will do is now that we have set up this new user account in Azure, we'll add it to our Azure group, right? So, and that's where the real power of this comes in, right? So on my FileMaker solution side, I don't have to do anything, right? So this is all management that I do in my Azure AD. And yes, the user will have to go through some steps, but I don't have to touch my solution at all, right? So I do all of my admin on the Azure AD side, right? So I just create a new user, I add it to the group, don't have to touch my solution because I already have that group set up as an account in my FileMaker solution. So once I'm done going through these steps, the user can just log in, right? I didn't have to touch my solution. That's where the real power is of using group-based authentication for these things, right? So, so this is the user having clicked that Microsoft button on the login dialog. They will log in on the Microsoft side. And at the end of that, they will just be in our solution, right? So I can't really stress that point long enough. The real power of doing this, the real benefit of doing this is that you don't have to do anything on FileMaker side, right? So once your FileMaker server is configured, once you've set up that group account on the FileMaker side, all the management is done completely away from FileMaker, right? So it can be done by anybody. If you have administrators that need to do this, they can do it, right? So they don't need to know your FileMaker solution at all. There was a question? So the question is, if you have Office 365 users, is the Azure AD already set up? Is that in place? By and large, yes. It's an ever-changing landscape, so I don't want to give a definitive answer. But in essence, as I understand it today, yes. If you have an organization that uses Office 365, you do have Azure AD, and you have the users already in place. Right? So this is the confirmation. That user that we just added to our Azure AD is now able to log into our solution without us touching that solution at all. Question?
On the original login dialog, can the account name and password be hidden so that they have to click Microsoft so they don't get frustrated because they're typing in what they think is their credentials, not realizing they have to click the Microsoft button?
Yeah. So the question is, you mean the FileMaker login dialog, right? So the FileMaker login dialog has two parts. The top part has the two entry fields, which are used for regular FileMaker accounts, and then you have the three buttons at the bottom. So the question is, can you hide the top section? No. And it can be a little confusing where the users will think, yes, I'll type in my Amazon credentials or my Azure credentials and then hit that button. But yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. Yep.
I didn't see an option to allow saving credentials there. Can you save credentials so they don't have to click the Microsoft?
Yep.
So
the question is, there's on some of the traditional FileMaker login dialogs, there's this option to say, can you save credentials to the keychain? You have none of that, right? So there's no saving of that. One more question, then we'll move on, and we'll save the questions to the end. Yep.
Describe the nature of the application, something like an application. I wasn't sure exactly what that meant.
Sure. So the question is, what is the nature of the application? You have to set up an application. I call it an application because they call it an application. It's the same on Google and same on Amazon. So the question is, what is the nature of the application? It's nothing but a shell. It's a placeholder where you can make configuration settings. That you can say, these are the accounts that belong to it. Things like that manifest that you say, yes, I will enable group authentication, that kind of thing. There's really nothing to the application on the provider side. It's kind of meaningless. It doesn't do anything. It's just a place where you go to make configuration settings. All right. All right, Amazon. So that's it for the Azure side. I hope I didn't confuse you too much, but it's basically the same structure always, right? So you configure FileMaker server, you go to the provider side, you configure an application that doesn't really do anything, but it's a place for configuration settings. Then you turn around and do some stuff add accounts to your FileMaker solution, right? So Amazon. So we'll go to the same place. We basically go to that database server, security tab. We click the button for Amazon, right? So what we see here is it's very similar to the page that we had for Azure, except that there's one less piece of information that we need. So we will have to put in a place, we'll have to find a place where we put in the redirect, the allowed return URL, right? That's the address that Amazon will use to talk back to us. And then we need a client ID and a client secret. All right, so we'll see where we can find those. We need to go to developer.amazon.com, right? And again, just like with Azure, you need to have an Amazon developer account. That's a given. I will log into mine. I have mine set up to use multi-factor authentication, right? So it'll ask me to confirm that I am who I am. Once we get past that, the developer.amazon console, if you will, has a service called Login with Amazon. That's where we will need to be, right? So we've logged into the developer console, apps and services, and right there is Login with Amazon. That's the one that we need. And it'll tell us you don't have anything, that's fine, we'll set it up. So it's called a security profile, right? So we'll create a security profile. The name is the equivalent of the application name, if you will, that we used on the Microsoft side, right? We'll just use DevCon 2017. Description is mandatory, doesn't really mean all that much as long as we put in something. The third piece there, consent privacy URL, again, that's not the address that we will use or that we will need to use to have Amazon talk back to FileMaker server, right? So that would be a place where you state your privacy and consent agreement, all of that. So not so important for the authentication purpose, so we'll just move past that. So this is cool. We know that we need a client ID and we need a client secret, so it's right there. We can click on it. We'll copy those over. And those are the two main pieces of configuration that we would need from the FileMaker server side, right? So I will just plop them in there. Then the only additional piece that we will need is we'll have to find that place where we put in that address that Amazon will use to talk back to our FileMaker server. All right. So we'll copy that one over so that we have the format. We can just replace what we need. But we know that as soon as we click Save here, we'll have to find a time to shut down our files and restart the FileMaker server. Now, web settings, in that profile, that's where we can set the allowed return URLs, right? So that's the address. That's where we put the address that Amazon will use to say, yep, we know this user, you can let him into your solution, right? So again, this is where we put in the fully qualified domain name, the DNS name, the one that is covered by the SSL certificate on our FileMaker server. And that's it for the FileMaker server side and the Amazon side. That's all we need to do for that one. So the next step is we'll have to do something in our FileMaker solution itself, right? So we'll have to create an account there that can be used. As you can see, we now have an Amazon button, right? It picked up on the fact that my FileMaker server is configured to allow Amazon accounts. As I mentioned, the big difference here with that Microsoft Azure thing is that now that we have set up our FileMaker server to allow Amazon accounts, right? Any Amazon account will do, right? So there's no concept of groups or adding users to a specific domain or anything like that. As long and you also see group or user, there's only users, right? So there's no concept of groups with Amazon and with Google, as we will cover in a sec, right? So for every user that we will need to give access through an Amazon account, we have to add them as an individual user under the accounts, right? So there's no groups in this area. So we'll pick Amazon, we'll put in the email address of that user, and after that, they're good to go, right? And it could be any Amazon account, as long as we add it. All right, so we'll close our file. We will reopen it, click the Amazon button, and see where it takes us.
Wait, real fast. Why do you close the file? Why don't you use the relogin?
Because I didn't make a relogin script. Yeah, no, it's a valid question. I could have saved myself some time by just doing the relogin thing. So it took me to the Amazon page for the login, same as the Azure page. You put in your credentials. Same kind of concept, right? So they all do that. The first time you log in, it will ask for your consent to say, yeah, are you sure that you want to use your account to log into this application? Browser behavior, all browsers are slightly different. When I now go to my data viewer, you will see that the account is there. You will also see that the new get function for get account group name is empty, right? There's no concept of groups with Amazon. There's no concept of groups with Google, so those will always be empty. If it's my mom, tell her I call her right back. All right, so that's it for Amazon, right? So this process is a whole lot simpler than the Azure one. Obviously, the Azure one was a little longer because we talked about the concepts, but that's it, right? So you set up your FileMaker server by creating an app on Amazon in that console, and after that, you're good to go. You add all the individual Amazon accounts that you want to have access, that you want to give access to your solution. You add them all individually to your file, right? So Google. Same thing, we'll go to our database server, security tab, we'll click on the button to enable Google, and we'll see what we need, right? So, and it's very similar to what we need for the Amazon side, right? So we'll have to find a place for the return address, and there's a client ID and a client secret. So it's almost identical to what happens on the Amazon side. So just like Amazon, Google has sort of like a developer website where you can create an application. So I'll log into that one. Just like my Amazon account, my Google account is set up for multi-factor authentication, so that I have a little extra layer of protection. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that is where a lot of the power is with using these kinds of external identity manager providers, right? So you get all the benefits of using these external authentication multi-factor, all of these things, right? So we'll put in the code that it's sent to my cell phone, and after that we will be in the Google developer console, right? So it says console developers google.com. All of that is documented in that white paper. Under credentials, you can create what is called an OAuth client ID. That's what we need, right? So we picked that. Web application is the one that we need. The name is the same as the application name. We'll use DevCon 2017 for that one. And right here already, it tells us this is where you can set the redirect URI, right? So that's that return URL that they will use to talk back to our FileMaker server, right? So we'll copy the format over, put it in there. We'll substitute our DNS name, and away we go. All right, so as soon as we save that, it shows us the client ID and the client secret. So those are the two pieces of information that we have to bring back to our FileMaker server and put in the admin console. So that's nice and easy, just like it was on the Amazon side. And that's sort of what I meant with this is surprisingly easy, right? It can be a little daunting because of all the acronyms and the way that things are named, but in essence, there's not a whole lot to it. Once you know where to go and configure these things, there's not a lot of things to it, right? So we've saved the settings, so we'll have to restart our FileMaker server. Don't need to wait for that. We'll turn around and see what we need to do in our FileMaker application, which is basically just create an account. And there's going to be a little bit of a twist here, because like many of you, I have the same email address that I use for different accounts, right? So I have an email address that is a Microsoft account. I have the same email address that is an Amazon account. I have the same email address that is a Google account, right? So I pick Google as my authentication mechanism. And, well, that's not, I'll put it later. But this is basically just one of my Google accounts. Set it up. Just like with Amazon, right? So there's no concept of groups. I know that I'm repeating myself, but there's no concept of groups. that means that every Google user that you want to give access to your solution, you have to set them up individually, right? So of those 3 new ones, only Microsoft Azure has that concept of a group. So all the other ones, you have to set up individual accounts. All right, isn't that interesting? Didn't expect that, right? So what happened here? If you were paying attention, the normal thing that would happen is that I get the login dialog, I click the button for the provider, I go to that provider's web page where I'm asked to put in my credentials, right? That didn't happen. It went straight into the browser saying, "Oh, are you sure you want to redirect to FileMaker?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." And then this happens, right? But I had just set up that account, right? So what happened is, and my browser wasn't even open, right? Safari is my default browser on that machine, right? So if I go to Gmail, which is owned by Google, and I log in, you'd see that it didn't ask me for any credentials either, right? So what happened here is I had cached credentials, right? I was logged into my browser with another Google account. And even though my browser was closed, those credentials were cached. And FileMaker, not FileMaker, but by me clicking that Google button, it made the round trip to Google. Google said, "I already know who you are," right? So I'll get you straight into FileMaker. But that particular account for the cached credentials didn't exist as a Google account in FileMaker. So FileMaker said, "Nope, I don't know who you are. This should not happen," right? So that is something to be aware of, right? Because the round trip goes out to the identity provider's web page, if you have logged in to another service of them before and you have stored your credentials, they're cached in the browser, they will be reused when you use this, right? So that's something to be aware of. Classic scenario is that you use your Google account, you're logged into Google, you close your browser, right? That doesn't mean that your credentials are not there anymore. If you walk away from your desktop, somebody may go in, just open that file, click that Google button on the login dialog, and they will use your credentials to get into the FileMaker file, right? So there's a whole realm of security considerations that we need to make with these services that are important, and that some of these I cover in that white paper as well. I have them listed as gotchas, so some things to consider. Right, so at this point, I've shown you in about the span of, we have 8 minutes left. In the span of about 30 minutes, I've showed you how to configure FileMaker Server for all 3 of these new providers. And I hope that I conveyed the message that it's not that hard, right? Once you know where to look, and the white paper will help you find that, but once you know where to look, it's not that daunting to set up. So what about FileMaker Go and FileMaker WebDirect, right? This is FileMaker WebDirect running on the same server. We have the same file hosted there. If I click that file, you see the same thing, right? So we have the same login options. All 3 of them are configured on FileMaker Server. If I click Amazon, I'm asked by Amazon to log in, and there you go, right? So same as in FileMaker Pro, WebDirect uses the same thing. And you'll see that I'm logged in with that Amazon account right there. Right? So no problem, WebDirect uses the same mechanism, works right off the bat. I want to pause here for a quick sec, because what happened here is that you see what it says, sign in to open DUI. DUI is one of my other files I have hosted on that server, right? So I had 3 files hosted on that server, the one that we've used for the demo and then 2 other ones. If I open or try to open this file, and we didn't touch that file in the demo, right? I didn't add any of those Google accounts, Microsoft accounts, Amazon accounts. I didn't do that in that file. But when I try to open that file, you get the same 3 options, right? Obviously, if I click those, nothing will happen, right? Because yes, you may be taken to the Google page to get authenticated, and you will be authenticated by Google. But when the traffic or when the request comes to FileMaker, FileMaker will say, I don't have an account in that file with that set of credentials, right? So the authentication will fail there. So keep in mind that when you configure your FileMaker server to use any of these 3 services, the login dialog will change for all the files that are hosted on that server, right? Not just the files where you created those accounts in. So something to keep in mind, right? So I'll drag my iPad on the screen here. This is FileMaker Go 16. So if I click on that file that we've just been using all along, you'll see it's the same mechanism, right? It works just as well. We get the same 3 options depending on what we have configured on the FileMaker server side, and it will work just as well. Right, I clicked on Amazon, we'll be taken to the Amazon page. In the mobile Safari, we'll be asked to log in, and we're good to go. So I'll skip past that one because you'll have to take my word that it works. And I promise you it does work. The REST API, the data API, that is new in FileMaker 16. And it does support the OAuth providers as well, right? Meaning that you can use the REST API, the new data API, with any of those accounts from Amazon, from Google, from Azure. Todd Geist has a very comprehensive write-up on it on his webpage, and you'll have that in the handouts after the session. So I won't go into too much detail, but he's got it all figured out, all written up, so it works. There's one more member to the FileMaker 16, or the FileMaker platform, right? That's FileMaker Cloud. And there's a clue here, right? So blue, not blue. FileMaker Cloud, as it is right now, is still based on the FileMaker Server 15 base, right? So it does not support any of the OAuth providers yet. There was a new version of FileMaker Cloud released last week or the week before, I think last week. If you read the release notes, it says that there will be a new version in October that will be based on FileMaker Server 16. So at that point, in October, we will have support for the OAuth providers as well on FileMaker Cloud, right? All right, almost done, 2 minutes. A quick recap. In blue, we have all 6 of the external authentication providers. In green, we have some of the things to consider. Right, so we have AD, Active Directory, OD, Open Directory, local accounts and groups on the FileMaker server machine, and then the 3 new ones, Azure, Amazon, Google, right? Of those, first line there, Active Directory and Open Directory require settings on the operating system of the machine, right? The machine has to belong. That's what I mean with requires machine membership, right? So the machine, the operating system, has to belong to the domain that you want to use. That is not true for any of the other ones. Azure, Amazon, and Google only, well, not true for Azure. Amazon and Google only work with individual accounts, right? Azure can work with individual accounts. AD, OD, local, and Azure have the concept of a group, right? So where you don't have to create individual accounts in your FileMaker file. You just have to create a group, and then the group membership is something that you manage completely outside of FileMaker, which is, in my opinion, is where the true power is of using external authentication. Now, Azure, Amazon, and Google, as I mentioned before, require internet connectivity, right? So the provider is outside your network, and it has to be able to communicate to your FileMaker server, right? So your FileMaker server has to be reachable from the internet, which is something to consider. SSO is one of the alphabet soup things that we hadn't mentioned, right? So single sign-on. Of these 6, only Active Directory can provide native single sign-on, right? The other ones don't do it. You can mimic it in a lot of ways, but only true on-premise Active Directory can give you true SSO. If you want to know more about that, look me up after the session, and we can talk about that. LDAP is the last of the alphabet soup ingredients. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, right? So I mentioned in the beginning, Active Directory, Open Directory, they're all called directory services. This is a protocol. LDAP is a protocol to talk to directory services, just like HTTP is a protocol to talk to a web server. There's a thing called Open LDAP, which is a directory service, not to confuse you. Don't care, right? It does nothing for authentication on the FileMaker side. I mentioned that as one of the early slides. There's mention of LDAP a little bit in the FileMaker admin console. Don't even go there, right? It does nothing for authentication. All right, so we only have 1 minute left. So what I suggest is that if you have any questions come up after, I may have to take you outside of the room to make room for the next presenter, but I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you may have. So thanks for being here.